is Jackie Brown Miller, and I'm with Reclaim Democracy. I have today two distinguished guests, Tom Linzey and Richard Grossman. Tom Linzey is with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund from Pennsylvania, and Richard is here from the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy. Tom, you're the executive director and co-founder of the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which was founded in 1995 in order to provide help to grassroots community organizations in things like fighting quarries and various environmental matters. But since then, your group has expanded its mission to help municipalities around Pennsylvania to roll back corporate rights through the passage of local ordinances. Would you tell us about how your environmental group made that shift?
Sure. First of all, thanks for having us here today for this important conversation. Use the word expanded. I guess we looked at it as expanded, deepened, and strengthened, which happened over a period of about 2 years from 1998 to 2000, and in fact continues to happen today. Instead of pretending or maybe putting out there that we have some kind of silver bullet that answers all the questions that folks are working on at the local level, these thousands of different single issues, and transitioning them into to different types of battles. The fact is we're still grappling with this stuff ourselves, about how to take different single issues, mostly single environmental issues at the grassroots level, and how do we transition them into something different. Because for a number of years we were working in the regulatory system. When a quarry would want to come into a rural community, a quarry corporation would try to force something into a rural community, folks would call us and they'd say, help, we need help, we can't afford a lawyer, legal fees run $200 to $400 an hour now, and our firm was set up in the beginning to provide free legal services. And we'd say, sure, we'll help you, we'll drive you right into the regulatory system. And you know, this quarry wants to come in, and they've done their own dust studies, they've done their own odor studies and water studies about how this is going to impact environmental features and also people's homes and enjoyment of their property in a certain area. And we would become very good at knocking out, you know, Section 28I of the regulations and getting a permit overturned temporarily. We'd have the victory parties at people's houses, and then we'd come back 6 months later, and inevitably the result was the same. Corporation would drive the facility into the community. All we did was maybe roughed off or smoothed off some of the rough edges of the permit process to make sure instead of 8 parts per billion particulate matter flowing into the air, that it's 4 parts per billion that was then allowed. And so we understood that we were doing a disservice to groups that we were helping. We were getting the awards and funding in the process because we were being good little boys and girls from a conventional environmental standpoint. And so the transition was of necessity. It was an understanding by us that we couldn't keep doing the work that we were doing, which was ostensibly to protect the natural environment in rural and communities, that we couldn't do that work if we stuck with the regulatory system. And we couldn't do that work if we stuck just with grassroots environmental groups. Because in 1998, our phone started ringing off the hook with 400 municipal governments in Pennsylvania who were calling us for the first time, a constituency that we weren't established to assist, calling us for the first time because these hog factory farms had begun to invade Pennsylvania. These 5,000, 7,000 head pork production facilities were being driven into the state. And the state legislature had so kindly, to the corporations, the agribusiness folks, limited the ability of municipalities to stop these things from coming in the same old way that they had been stopping them over the past dozen years.
So the corporations went to the legislature and said, make it so that only the state can regulate factory farms in the state and no localities can do that?
Yeah, the most fascinating thing is they didn't have to go to them at all because they already were them. The House and the Senate ag committees in most states are controlled by the same agribusiness interests who see the concentration and corporatization of agriculture as inevitable. In this country, 4 corporations now control 70% of pork production. It's not unusual just pork, of course, beef production, chicken, poultry production, cheese production. The other day I read that Kraft controls 60% of cheese production in the United States. So this corporate concentration isn't anything unfamiliar to the agribusiness or agricultural industry. We always say that we've lost 300,000 farmers in this country over the past 20 years, as if we can't find them. You know, where did they go? We can't find these 300,000 farmers. They've been eliminated. They've been pushed out of a market by this corporate concentration.
So what did the municipal governments want from you?
Well, they had turned to the same places that they would turn for help before, and were told, well, there's nothing you can do because the state has now passed these laws that forbid you from regulating them in a certain fashion, which up till then they had used to keep these facilities out. And so our phone was ringing off the hook because folks were in a panic. These rural municipal officials were being pressured by their citizens to keep these things out. Meanwhile, their solicitor, their attorney hired by the municipality was saying there's nothing you can do about these things. And so we started down, Robert Frost's poem about taking a different path, less traveled. And lo and behold, when we started looking around for places that had done this work differently, in other words, not focused on parts per billion or water pollution or trying to minimize the adverse environmental impacts from regulating facilities, understanding that the word regulate means you're going to allow it to come in anyway, you're just going to regulate it afterwards, that we found these laws in the Midwestern United States, these 9 states that had passed laws banning agribusiness corporations from owning or controlling farms. And that was a real eye-opener to us because it was the first time we had seen anybody dealing with this issue in a way that shifted from the environmental impacts and regulating those as an ongoing facility towards focusing on the corporate actors and saying, we understand why we have factory farms. We have them because 4 corporations control the pork production process in the United States. Instead of just sitting back and agreeing to regulate these things a little bit better, we're going to go after the real problem, which is this structural, vertically integrated, corporate-controlled agricultural system that we have in the United States today.
And what it meant that they were doing is like they're pulling a thread off somebody's lapel, and it just keeps pulling and pulling and pulling, because what you start opening up is the past 200 years of history in this country, where, in fact, it turns out that the road was not so much less traveled by, but it's been less publicized. That at every step of the way over the generations, when the first the slave class and the corporate class were trying to concentrate their power and turn their power into law by driving their amendments into the Constitution and their interpretations in the Constitution, there were people resisting at every step of the way. So as the process in Pennsylvania in these communities, it forces people to deal with the past to figure out how we got into this mess. So in fact, the companies didn't have to go to the legislature because they already had 100, 200 years of property law and 200 years of other kinds of law, which we have to deal with it at every step of the way. It becomes a process of revealing the reality in order then to reconfigure the way the groups are going and change the strategies, change the tactics, and change the arenas.
We had these great stories coming out of rural Pennsylvania of people who still believe, or believed then, that we live in a democracy, where they got 51% of all the people together in a rural municipality to sign a petition to say, we don't want this thing coming in, we want to be able to say no. Well, they put it in, and then the lawyer and the experts from the agribusiness industry come in and say, we're sorry, you don't have the authority to say no. You can regulate it, play around with the knobs a little bit, but you don't have the authority as a community, even if 51% of you don't want this, to say no to this coming in. And it ran them smack dab up against 250 years.
Let me just, I think I'm a little bit confused. So the municipalities passed these laws, and then there must have been some kind of corporate lawsuit where they ran smack dab into the 250 years, right?
Yeah, actually they ran smack dab in it once they thought that 51% of people within a community could actually say no to something that wanted to come in. But the step that we skipped was that we took the laws from those Midwestern states and we brought them into Pennsylvania and we reworked them into a municipal law under which those municipal governments could ban agribusiness corporations from owning or controlling farms. And to date, 11 municipalities and 5 counties have passed those laws. Immediately what began to happen was that the agribusiness corporations can't let those sit. They can't let them stand. If we lived in a democracy, that would have been the end of the story. Folks got active, they came up to their elected officials and said, we want you to do this. The elected officials said, hey, we understand. We're going to pass this to basically give you what you want as a community. That would have been it. End of story. People organized, came up, drafted something, passed it at the local level to deal with a problem, to set their vision, future for what they want for their community. That would have been it. But instead, this invisible apparatus kicks in. And the agribusiness corporations went after these folks in the legislature and in the courts. They basically used the arms
and the culture.
And the culture. And hired a PR firm to say, these aren't factory farms at all, they're advanced farms or modern farms. So the language started to shift too. And into that culture mix, they dropped a lawsuit They sued one of our smallest municipal governments who had passed one of these laws. And legislatively, they used their supported legislators to come after the municipalities by introducing legislation to strip away lawmaking power from the local governments.
Okay.
And so they came at them from those different directions.
Tell us about the lawsuit and how it resulted in you writing a brief to abolish corporate personhood, and what was the basis of your argument that corporate personhood violates the Constitution?
Well, it was a 2-year evolution for us, but when the folks in this place called Belfast Township, Fulton County, passed the anti-corporate farming law, the agribusiness folks sued them. The agribusiness folks came after them in a certain way. And as happens community after community after community, it's not the exception, it's the rule. What they said was to the community, you have no authority to treat us as a corporation differently from family farmers.
Okay.
That was the basis of the argument. There were others, but that was the crux of it. And they said, you can't do that because we, the corporation, the directors and officers of the corporation, are persons under the law. And therefore, because corporations are persons, you can't treat us differently under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution than family farmers. So they were saying to these folks in this community, you have no authority to treat agribusiness corporations or corporate farming systems differently than independent family farmers or independent family farm systems in this community. That's how they came at them, using the courts with this whole parade of constitutional rights that now shield and protect corporations and the few that run them under the Constitution, and allows them to trump communities and what those visions are at the community level.
And it's really important to see how the people in Pennsylvania forced the change in taxes, because prior to these ordinances, the issue was being debated and discussion. It was about the odor, the science, the efficiency, you know, what's the best way to grow the hogs or the cattle. As soon as these townships passed the law, then both the corporate leaders and the politicians and the PR people all came in. It's no longer science, it's no longer odor, it's you have no authority. And what that does is reveal a reality that provokes the people even more to go further, which is what they did.
Basically, people were seizing the authority to define what agriculture looked like in their jurisdiction, and they were being told that was beyond their authority. So they went back and they flipped open the Pennsylvania Constitution and they said, well, you know, Article 1 says people are the source of all governing authority. So how can you tell us that we don't have the authority to define what agriculture looks like in our jurisdiction? That also led to the second part of your question, which was municipalities, rural elected officials, as well as the community groups who we were dealing with, said, wait a second, we can pass these ordinances, but what good does it do to pass local laws if corporations can use constitutional rights of persons within the Constitution, but also the Commerce Clause and the Contracts Clause, and all kinds of good language in there that empowers corporations to override the rights of communities? And if that's the situation, then don't we need to take it on frontally? Don't we need to go after these corporate rights frontally? I'll never forget one of the meetings where an elected township official stood up and said, we need to take these corporate rights on because they're stopping us from doing what we need to do within our jurisdiction to make law. It's pretty straightforward stuff. And so we said, well, what do you want us to do about it? And they said, well, we want you to draft up a local law that refuses to recognize that corporations have constitutional rights, basically strip corporations of constitutional rights. So we said, yeah, we can do that. And so we went back and we drafted the ordinance, and in 2003, 2 local governments in Pennsylvania became the first local governments in the United States to pass a binding law stripping corporations of constitutional rights.
Has that law been challenged in court?
Not yet, but we hope it is, because the strange thing about this organizing is, whereas usually as environmental groups or community organizations we cower in the corner waiting for the court challenge to come or waiting for some other shoe to fall, in this situation you're provoking the right fight. You're provoking it in a language and programming the response in such a way that it has to come. Otherwise, you can't do the organizing. The model that we've built, it's kind of like jiu-jitsu, where it understands that we in reality have very little power, at least under this current structure. When the aggressor comes at you, you're able to turn the energy against them, make it into an issue of democracy rather than about farming or manure or parts per million or odor. Put it in your language and put us in a place where we can finally start to win this stuff, not by relying on a court to say, oh yeah, gee, justices, we made a mistake, and the last 200 years have been a huge error about giving constitutional rights to corporations. That's not going to happen. We may find a real living, breathing judge who looks at this stuff and says, something here is just not quite right. But in reality, we're turning to the courts for a remedy, where the courts were the ones that conferred constitutional rights on corporations. Something's fundamentally wrong there if we actually think that the courts are going to give us a remedy.
You talk about, I'm sorry, you talk about the fact that corporations have these powers and therefore we don't live in a democracy. Can you talk about, is there some sort of constitutional right that we as people have, like maybe participating equally in a democratic system, that corporate personhood is resulting in a violation of that right? And how does that work?
Well, it's even more basic than that. This model brief that we've drafted to argue that corporate rights are incompatible with the fundamental structure of democracy that ostensibly we have in this country are 4 basic points. Number 1, people have fundamental and inalienable rights. Those are civil and political rights that we have before we even create governments. Now, this is just from us being us. It's the fundamental underpinnings of the American Revolution. We have fundamental and inalienable rights. That we create governments to secure those rights, to secure, defend, and protect them. Wouldn't make any sense if we form governments to deny our own rights. That just fundamentally doesn't make any sense. Governments have conferred rights on the corporate few through the constitutional framework. And those corporate few then use those rights to deny our rights. You know, back to the community saying we want to define farming a certain way, corporations using those corporate rights to say, you can't, you don't have the authority to do that. Under this structure, governments are forbidden from denying rights of people directly. What's happening here is indirectly, governments are conferring rights that are used to deny the rights of people.
Right.
So the whole structure is incompatible with democracy.
And why it's so necessary to go along this line and probably other ways that people are going to come up with is that really it's been 100 years since the populist revolt in this country at the end of the 19th century, when a significant number of people came together in order to exercise their rights that had been denied. That we have no rights unless we exercise them. And what is happening is people are seeing that if they don't exercise those rights, and if they slip into or allow themselves to be channeled into the kind of organizing that has been the characteristic of the 20th century, most labor, environmental, human rights organizing has relied on regulatory agencies winning regulatory type laws to assert the rights and really challenge, throw the challenge wide open as to whose values are going to be backed by law. Who will wield the Constitution against whom? Who will wield the armed might of the state against whom? That's the essence of the struggle. It's the essence of the struggle that was of the abolitionist movement, of the women's movement, of some aspect of the civil rights movement. And it also means that we have to overcome our misunderstanding, most people's misunderstanding, and ours before we started looking into it, of what the progressive era was about and what the New Deal was about. Because neither the progressive era nor the New Deal were about fundamentally asserting the rights of the majority of people over the minority of people who had been wielding the law since the country was founded.
You guys have been traveling around the country teaching what you're calling democracy schools. Will you tell me a little bit about why you're doing that, what you teach, and how people can find more out about the democracy school?
Well, we came to a point where we were getting phone calls into the office where folks wanted us to help them replicate this work in different places. And those evolved into 2-hour and 3-hour phone calls. And finally someone said, why are you responding to all these requests with eating up such tremendous amounts of time? And we said, well, that's just what we do. And they said, why don't you start a school of sorts? And we said, well, do you think anybody would come? And they said, sure. And so we launched a school at Wilson College in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. It was the first democracy school named after a child named Daniel Pennock, who died after being exposed to some agribusiness activity in Pennsylvania. And we are now teaching our 34th school here in Seattle, which is the inaugural Seattle school. We, at the end of 2005, will have 7 permanent full-time operating schools across the United States. And the format is the same. The curriculum is the same for all of them. They are 3-day intensive weekend seminars, where on Friday night we talk about the failures of the environmental regulatory system, or failures of the regulatory system to protect communities and the environment. On Saturday, we talk about corporate rights and the history of people's movements in this country. Saturday we do 5 hours on Pennsylvania, how work is progressing and what's being done. And Sunday we help people to reframe their own single issues back home.
I mean, one of the hopes is that as more and more people sort of are grappling with this stuff and they start to apply their own creativity and the results of their experience, that people will start coming up with more and more creative ways of doing this work. We're very wary about saying this is the model. I mean, what's going on in Pennsylvania is the model and everybody should follow it this way. What we're trying to draw out of that and out of other great people's struggles is what are the principles, what are the basic criteria that people need to take into account as they reframe some basic question and see how they can drive it into a local legislature, rather than getting stuck in agencies like zoning boards and planning boards and courts, where in fact you can't even raise these kinds of questions. So we're really seeking to tap in people's intelligence and experience and the creativity, and create all kinds of new methodologies over the next couple of years.
And we've really been amazed by the response. We have, I think, over 100 people on a waiting list to now get into the existing schools.
Great.
And so folks are grappling and searching for new solutions and feeling the same type of frustration that at least I've felt doing the regulatory work over the past few years.
Right. There's another reason why, because if in fact this work is only taking place in Pennsylvania, I mean, let's say there are 70-odd communities that have passed various ordinances, but let's say even goes up to 200 or 300, and it doesn't begin to happen in other communities across the country. I mean, if other communities, I mean, for example, the numbers of communities that have passed resolutions against the Patriot Act, it's very nice to pass a resolution, but it doesn't trigger this process. If they started turning that into local ordinances to say, we are ordering our police and our librarians and every other officials of this community not to cooperate with the FBI or the U.S. government in any of this because everything they're doing is unconstitutional, that would do the same kind of triggering that is going on in these communities, where the next level of government has to come back and say, you have no authority to do this. And then it's clearly a struggle, not over the language of the ordinance, not over the odor, not over the science, not over, this is free speech and this is not, but do the people where we live through our duly elected legislators have the authority to say these are our values and these are the rules that we're laying down, and in fact the sheriff of this community will enforce this ordinance even against the FBI or the military or whatever.
So it sounds like what you're saying is you need to get a group of people together who are hot about an issue, and let's say it's big box stores and they say we're going to ban corporate-owned big box stores in our town, or some other ordinance that actually really has teeth and prohibits some type of corporate behavior, and then to fight the challenge maybe with a follow-up ordinance that says, well, oh, you're going to file a legal brief saying we can't do this based on your constitutional rights, corporation. Okay, we're going to pass another ordinance and we're going to say that's not legitimate in our town. Is that kind of, so I guess the question would be, how does a local community group find their issue? I'm sure the
issues find them, I think, as
yeah.
you know. There's no shortage of assaults that are coming into every community in this country that are driven by corporations operating in the default, under the default of the corporate state.
But it's very important that those issues be real and imminent. In other words, the energy or the power plant for running through this organizing model really only comes from folks whose lands, homes, families are being threatened. I mean, very real things. And that's what drives folks to go through the process. But, in terms of, there's thousands of single issues out there. Just to let you know, we have 100 communities in Pennsylvania who have passed laws dealing with two issues. Of the thousands of single issues out there, we've focused on two. It's taken us 6 years to get there. Larry Goodwin, who wrote a book called The Populist Moment about the populist movement in the United States, said that one of the biggest challenges is to create the safe spaces that people need to come together to talk about this stuff.
To dare to aspire grandly.
Hopefully not expire.
No. Dare to aspire
grandly. That perhaps is the most important piece, because the democracy schools are the safe spaces, or some safe spaces where people come together. But this work is all at its base about making it okay to be disobedient. How bad do things have to get in this country? And people are told to act reasonably and not raise their voices and participate in a certain neutral manner when making a point. It's time to really to look at this stuff and say, how bad does it have to get before we start using the types of tools and vehicles that the populists and the abolitionists used, and really standing on their shoulders as we go through this process to put together real movements that don't rely on the courts to validate them, because the courts will never validate them. And the product is not a winning court suit. The product is not an ordinance. We get requests for ordinances all the time. It's not the language, it's not the paper, it's not the ink that that goes into making the ordinance. It's the fact that you have a movement of people who are willing to step outside the box and who are willing to say, I'm not going to sit back while this whole place falls apart and pretend to be reasonable.
And it's really, there's so much about teaching ourselves to see differently. I mean, so I'm at the point, and don't try this at home alone. I mean, you really have to do it with other people in your community. But I see, as I read the founding documents and I look back at history, that I think that those humans who support and enable the perpetuation of the corporate state, in which is inherent is the denial of people's rights, I think that qualifies as treason. Because you have, it's treason and usurpation when the full faith and credit and the military power and the culture power of the government is enabling a few people clothed in these corporations to deny the rights of the majority and to be basically set up a system that's based on poisoning and destruction of public health and of the planet, and is contributing to the American empire, and that's against the will of the people. I think that is considered treason.
You've both said in the past, this isn't an anti-corporate, this isn't about being against corporations per se, but we the people want something, that we want to get something through our participation in our democracy, and it's being blocked by this corporate power, and that this corporate power is facilitated by certain legal doctrines like corporate personhood and corporations having standing under, say, the Commerce Clause and the Property Clause and stuff like that. There's one other sort of little aspect to this too, which is there's been talk about not being able to really protect the environment until the environment has standing in the Constitution as well. And I know that you have a local government who's working on a charter under the local home rule provisions, and that they are maybe trying to give nature rights under their local constitution or charter. Can you just talk about that briefly?
43 states have home rule provisions either in their constitution or in their statutes. They basically allow people to move to a higher level than just pass an ordinance at the local level. It basically means ripping down the old government and writing a whole new one to put in its place. We have folks who are ready to move beyond just the question of ripping down corporate rights, but asking the really tough question of not what can we get, but what do we want? And how do we build that world and write a local constitution for themselves? And the home rule process allows us to do that. But in reality in this country, mountains, ecosystems, egrets, rivers, trees, they don't have rights. They're property. They're property. At one point in this country, of course, people were property too under the slave system. That we've never really had an environmental movement in this country. We've never had an environmental movement because the movement has never sought to drive rights for those entities into our fundamental frameworks of governance. It's never happened. And so what we're trying to do at the local level is begin to build those in, where
Great.
Nature would have constitutional rights.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we're out of time. It's so sad that our time just flies when we're having good conversations. Thank you both for coming. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.